In a small town called Bethsaida on the northern coast of the Sea of Galilee, there was a fisherman named Simon. We don't know much of anything about this man's past or why he would one day become famous. One day, another man, who would also go on to become known throughout the entire world, approached Simon and asked him to follow him. According to the story, Simon dropped his nets, left his family, and joined this man. Simon, who would take on the name Peter, which has its root in the word rock, became a close confidant for his leader, Jesus. After a few years, Jesus was crucified, and Peter spent the next few decades traveling, writing, and sharing his story of Jesus to all who would listen. Along with his friend and missionary partner Paul, this new sect of Judaism spread throughout the entire Roman world. We now know this to be called Christianity, but in the first century of the Common Era, it was often referred to as the Way. Three major church centers would emerge: Alexandria, founded by Mark the Evangelist, Antioch, and Rome. The latter two were both founded by Peter, but Rome would emerge as the primary center of this new Christian church. We don't know for a fact that Peter was ever in Rome, but tradition holds that he was crucified under the reign of Emperor Nero around the year 66. Seen as the Bishop of Rome in a long line of bishops that would follow Peter, it really wasn't until the 11th century that this position would be recognized and cemented as the Pope of the Roman Catholic Church.
Welcome to the History of Modern Politics. That was Matt Wittlief, and my name is Chris Spangle, and we are here giving you the full backstory of our modern conversations, starting from Rome and moving forward. And that was Matt talking about the foundation, essentially, of the Catholic Church and the Pope of Rome, which plays a gravitational pull in Western civilization. And we felt that it was important to start with Paul and Peter and the most influential religion that will play into the Anglo-American tradition.
Yeah, that's right. And while we won't talk much about the church today and the rest of this episode, it is contemporaneous to the rest of the things that we'll be talking about today when we cover the era from the emergence of the power of Julius Caesar around 60 BCE and taking us all the way through about the year 180 of the Common Era as we look at the height of the Roman Empire.
Yeah, I mean, Christianity started with just that story, basically, and completely transformed the world through the next centuries and really continued to shape our world today. But let's start back with Caesar. We ended the last episode talking about the triumvirate and what was ahead with Cassius and Pompey and Julius Caesar. So let's start with Julius Caesar. He's probably, we're talking about maybe the two most famous men in all of history, like Jesus and Julius Caesar. Whether you know this or not, July is named after Julius Caesar and August is named after his predecessor, Augustus. And you are constantly thinking about Julius Caesar and his calendar, for instance, and you probably didn't even know it. But Julius Caesar, I would say, Matt, is like top 3 most famous humans to ever live along with Jesus.
Oh, yeah. I mean, Julius Caesar is incredibly well known, obviously, and through the centuries that follow, there's a serious Julius Caesar envy that follows throughout the rest of Western Europe in terms of people trying to replicate what he was able to do. And he's an incredibly unique man, right? I mean, right. He starts as largely a political animal. He's incredibly sharp. There's no doubt that his intelligence was probably off the charts. He turns out to be later, and we mostly know him for his military prowess, but he was an amazing, obviously general. And then you add to that, he's actually a prolific writer, which I
mean, he's why we know a lot about the Celts.
The Celts, I mean, his writing from his war journals were used in textbooks for people to learn Latin for literally a millennia in terms of his crisp, clear writing and command of the language. So, I mean, I think about it today. It's like, imagine if George Washington had the genius of Thomas Edison, and was able to also write about all that he did. It's just like a pretty mind-blowing combination that Caesar had.
Yeah, I mean, he is an interesting and figure in history. So let's start with his beginnings. He comes from the Julii family. He's a nephew of Marius. He was he served under Sulla. Did he serve under, what was his
Yeah, I believe it was a quaestorship under Sulla. But obviously with the conflict and the fighting between Sulla and Marius, once Sulla really came into power and started to look to extinguish any remnants of Marius's family, he went into hiding. He left Rome. And once Sulla was dead, and he felt it was going to be safe to come back, he gets captured by pirates, right? So ultimately, he's able to pay a ransom and raise an army and fight back the pirates. But he's got an incredibly interesting story, kind of from day one, really.
Yeah, so he, in the middle of his Gallic Wars, he makes 2 attempts at invading Britain in 55 and 54 BC, really, people wanted to command in this era armies to invade places like Gaul so they could take all of the wealth from it. And this really starts in the preceding decades, where you have the generals, as we mentioned, who have an army beholden to them because they go into a place like Gaul, which is modern day France and parts of Germany, and they go into Spain and Africa and Asia and loot it, basically, and they get to keep the wealth. It is like civil asset forfeiture for nobles, and so he builds a lot of wealth, and he uses his military adventures. Those journals that he mentioned were public journals. These were pieces of information that he would leak out, and he also used debt to become popular. Kenneth Pringle writes at Public Seminar, the Julii had fallen on hard times, and it was very expensive to run for office, as it is today in America. And he had to find ways to make a name for himself. So he borrowed to fund his election campaigns by staging Olympic-type games. And he doled out free grain and other typical expenses of the candidates and office holders. So Caesar found an almost endless wealth source of wealth in Marcus
Licinius Crassus.
Thank you. Crassus, who that's how I've just referred to him, Crassus, whose fortune and greed were legendary. Rome lacked anything like a modern fire department, so Crassus would dispatch his own private fire brigade to the site of a conflagration, but refused to extinguish it until the poor owner agreed to sell him the property. Only after the transaction was agreed to would Crassus send in the firefighter. So he ended up amassing a large amount of land and property, which was the foundation of wealth in ancient Rome, and owned good chunks of Rome through this process. So in 61 BCE, Crassus came to Caesar's rescue with a loan of 830 talents, an immense sum amounting to about an eighth of Crassus's fortune. And he was the richest man in Rome, writes Caesar's biographer, Christian Meyer. It might be worth around $500 million today. That's how much he put into all of these circuses. Now, the problem with Crassus, from Caesar's point of view, was that he expected to be repaid. And so to do that, Caesar had a bigger prize, which was the consulship. It was Rome's highest office, as we mentioned in the last one. And if Crassus supported Caesar, Caesar promised to cut taxes. So to guarantee victory in the 59 BCE election, Caesar brought a third member into his cabal, Pompeius Magnus, the great military hero of the day, a wealthy man because of those conquests himself. And he would bring votes, senatorial support, and even more wealth. And Pompey needed his recent military victories confirmed and land provided for his returning troops, so they didn't turn on him. So this is how the first triumvirate was born, and it was sealed by Pompey's marriage to Caesar's daughter, Julia. Caesar was then elected, and he proceeded to ram through his entire legislative agenda with an unexpected ruthlessness. So you see the foundation of that first triumvirate is just seething, Matt, in corruption and driven by Julius Caesar's own need to pay back his debt or else. And it is really a fascinating insight into the character of these three men.
Absolutely. I mean, and these men don't really like each other for the most part, right? So it is an alliance of convenience, and the main thing that all three of them had in common was they just sought more. They wanted more power, more fame, more glory, more riches. I mean, while Crassus had all the money, he didn't have the same military prowess and recognition that, say, Pompey had. And Pompey didn't necessarily have all the wealth. And Julius Caesar wanted both of it, right? He was still kind of an emerging guy on the scene at this point in time, right? Crassus was well established amongst the leadership in Rome. Pompey was well established at this point in time. So Julius Caesar is a little bit of a new player on the scene. He had held a handful of public offices throughout the preceding decade, just kind of slowly climbing up the ladder, trying to establish himself within the elites of the Roman society. But he wanted to get out like many of the others to command a military, command a force. And so, part of what was allowed as he wrapped up his consulship was giving him this imperium, they called it, right? The command of a military, and, through a governorship over the regions that included Gaul, right? So through this, he ended up having 5 legions under his command. And now he's got troops, he's got allies, and he's just itching for a good fight, and finds excuses to head into Gaul and look to invade and conquer.
Yeah. So he, like you mentioned, climbed the ladder, served as an elected military tribune, a first step. And this is a very common climbing of that ladder that everybody would participate in. It was very expensive to participate in. He was elected a quaestor for 69 BC and went to serve his quaestorship in Hispania. 65 BC was elected curule adel and staged lavished game. I should let you pronounce things because I'm not good at pronouncing things that aren't like Hoosier English. And staged lavish games that won him further attention and popular support. 63 BC, was Pontifex Maximus, a chief priest of the Roman state religion. 60 BC sought elections as consul for 59 BC. That election was wrapped in all kinds of accusations of corruption. Cato, who had a reputation for incorruptibility, even resorted to bribery to get rid of one of Caesar's opponents because he was trying to fight the decline of the Roman state, which brings us up to the triumvirate and the triumph. What is a triumph? Yeah,
a triumph was a massive military victory parade, right? It had long traditions in the Roman Republic going back into the very early days in the 6th century before the Common Era, right? So the pinnacle of glory in the Roman culture was to have a triumph, a big parade, really, held in your name and on your behalf. And this was like the top honor, and everybody was always trying to seek ways to gain a triumph.
Yeah.
So
now, what are some ways that people saw him as a threat, and they knew that he was a very dangerous person.
He had those sharp elbows, right?
Yeah, I guess the way to put it is you see politicians like Bill Clinton or Donald Trump come to Washington, D.C., and the people who are in the swamp immediately start trying to do things to limit their power or to limit their abilities. Did that happen to Julius Caesar?
Well, absolutely. And the one way they tried to limit his power was giving him after his reign as consul, or his term as consul, was to put him into a much smaller position, right? And so they were going to kind of give him some of the backwoods of northern Italy, and through some deal making, he's actually able to get a law passed that gives him that governorship over a few territories. Like I was saying, the one is the Cisalpine Gaul, which is northern Italy today, Illyricum, which is southeastern Europe, and then they ultimately end up adding Transalpine Gaul, which is southern France. These are all Roman territories, right? So north of this is where the barbarians are, the savages, right? The Celtic people, the Germanic tribes, the Celtic tribes. So, by seeking to put Julius Caesar outside of Rome and get him into territories to oversee. They were trying to get him out of their backyards, but they end up through the deal making that Julius Caesar is able to do. He also is out of their backyard and has legions of armies under his command.
Yeah, and you want to be the head of a province because you get to loot it. And so the thing you have to keep in mind when studying Roman history is that anytime you see somebody in a position of power, there's usually some financial structure. You want to be the governor of Africa because there's tremendous wealth with their grains, for instance. And Gaul had a lot of wealth, and he used this through his Gallic Wars to win glory by expanding the territory of Rome, tried to go into Britain, as we mentioned. But who are some other people that are important in this story besides just Julius Caesar?
Yeah. So let's move across the English Channel and look to the island for a moment. So we have Commius. So Commius is actually king of one of these tribes on the island, and he sees a way to make a deal, right? Because he knows that Caesar is at his doorstep. Caesar has marched his armies north, going through Gaul, has his eye on the coast, and Commius is sent as an envoy to try to see if they can't make some deals and such. And at that point, Caesar strikes a bargain with him, and now you've got this kind of setup, and Caesar has his client based in Britain right as he's getting ready to invade.
Yeah. And what else?
Yeah, and so Caesar invades, right? And his first attempt in 55 BCE kind of doesn't go, he's not successful. There's then another attempt after the winter passes in 54 BCE, and this time he starts to make some headway and is able to, get some territory in there in his second expedition. But now a new leader has emerged out of the various British tribes named Castellovanius, and he is, ultimately they're trying to fight back Caesar and this massive army of Romans that has come across with, all of their weapons and technology advances.
Yeah. And again, I would say there's a great podcast called, what's the one that you recommended to me? The British History
podcast. Yeah.
Yeah. And he really covers in depth this invasion and how afraid the soldiers were of crossing the channel, and they get hit by a massive storm, which wipes out a lot of boats and soldiers, which happened frequently. I mean, you're moving troops, hundreds of thousands of troops sometimes in boats. And if you get hit with a bad storm, then those people drown and they're gone. But they managed to, they're landing around Dover, and they manage to fight off the Romans because they use chariots. They're great charioteers. And Caesar talks about how vicious and skilled the warriors in these lower tribes are, especially at horse riding and charioteering. So good on them fighting against Julius Caesar.
So Caesar makes some headway. Commius helps negotiate the surrender of Castellovanius. But now back in France, back in Gaul, it's not completely pacified, and there are some revolts, and a new leader of the Gaulish people is starting to rally, all the various tribes and groups together. Because you got to remember, these are, as we talked about last time, Gaul is not a kingdom at this point, right? There are still all sorts of different tribes and groups, and they don't necessarily all get along with each other. So it makes it very easy for someone like Julius Caesar or any of the Roman generals, frankly, to kind of go through a lot of these territories and just run roughshod, because they have a professional military fighting force at this point. They are a unified front, and they're able to pit groups against each other and, take on one group at a time. So Caesar has to leave the island of Britain and is not able to establish full control. He's got a little bit of a loyal client state in there through his connection with Commius, But one of my favorite names in history now, it starts to emerge, and that's Vercingetorix of the Gaulish people, right? So he is somehow been able to convince the various tribes and groups of the Gauls to unite and rally and fight against Julius Caesar. And if you want to learn more about these battles that kind of ensue in the Gallic Wars, I mean, I definitely highly recommend Dan Carlin's podcast. In particular, the Celtic Holocaust, right, where he goes into a lot of detail of the things we talked about last week, a little bit about who are these Celtic people, but a lot of good time is spent around the battles between Vercingetorix and Julius Caesar.
It really does motivate people to band together to fight an enemy when you're trying to, like, basically genocide an entire group of people while enslaving them, selling them back to Rome for slave labor, stealing all of their things. It tends to really tick people off.
Yeah.
So Caesar is in Gaul, fighting in Gaul, amassing troops, territory, wealth, and that is starting to make the folks in the Senate nervous.
They're a little nervous. Yeah.
They're getting nervous because you don't want, it's like, the thing about being in Gaul is that you can just march, you have a land pass to Rome. If you want somebody like Julius Caesar and his anti-Senate army in a place like Africa or Greece or some place where it's hard to march and you have to bring everything via boat. So Gaul is kind of the worst possible place for Caesar to be positioned. And so how does the Senate start to fight back?
Yeah, well, first of all, Caesar wins, right? Vercingetorix surrenders, and now Caesar starts heading back to Rome, ready for his triumph, ready for his fame and glory. But the Senate strips him of his command, right? And so, under Roman law, as long as you are holding a consulship or a proconsulship or various other titles of a magistrate, you cannot be convicted of any crime, right? But Caesar knows that as soon as he has his title stripped from him, that his political enemies are going to find reasons to have him arrested and probably killed. So Caesar marches his army up famously to the Rubicon River, which is forms a boundary, and now it's time for that life or death decision. Will he stay and with his army on the other side of the Rubicon? Will he cross peacefully and put himself up to the fates and see what happens, or will he proverbially roll the dice and cross the Rubicon with his army? And we all know what happens next.
Yeah, he invades, and there is a civil war with Pompey, who is representing the Senate and fighting for the true republic, while Caesar's also fighting for the true republic. And both sides are fighting to restore the republic and make sure that everything is just safe. And then eventually you have Brutus and Cassius, and they're fighting for the true republic. And everybody's just very concerned with, in reality, they just want to win so they can have all the power. But the rhetoric through this period is all about fighting the traitors and restoring the republic. Now, he ends up winning against Pompey and destroys his forces, and Caesar's declared dictator for life. It's kind of a jump.
Right. Yeah. His now the Senate is filled with yes man for Caesar, and he is, as you said, dictator for life. And there is opposition, right? Cato is still around. Cicero is still around. But they don't have, they're not military guys right now. To have the power in Rome, you've got to have the money and you've got to have the swords.
Yeah. You have somebody like Cicero, who basically was the gold standard for Latin, one of the most famous lawyers. He was the Johnny Cochran of his day. Like, if you got in trouble, you called Cicero, and he would, for a very handsome fee, defend you. Very influential on our understanding of the law. And Cicero is the person that we know the most about in classical history, because 96 letters, was it 96 or 900? There's some crazy amount of documentation. Cicero's letters, Cicero's journals, his written texts managed to survive history. So we know a tremendous amount about Cicero, which is why you've probably heard his name every once in a while. But he was a great lawyer. But his wealth, he was wealthy, but his wealth was that of a person who had become wealthy within Rome.
Right.
Versus these men who had become wealthy in all of these territories with massive armies. So their opposition is very tepid, and really they have to align themselves with people like Pompey, or later Mark Antony or Octavian or Julius Caesar. And you find the nobility starting to pick sides, and then when they lose, they get slaughtered. And Caesar, part of his success is that when he comes back after beating Pompey, is he doesn't do that. He does arrest Cicero, but he doesn't do what Sulla and Marius did, where he used political violence to slaughter his opposition. And that is one of the reasons that he maintained a lot of good faith with the public, because he built stability instead of being oppressive against even the nobles, who a lot of your plebeians worked for the nobles, right? That's where a lot of their jobs came from. So he was very popular in a lot of ways.
Yeah, but all good things come to an end, or if you want to call that a good thing. And famously, he is assassinated, and then a second triumvirate emerges, mostly of Caesar loyalists, Mark Antony, as we've mentioned, Caesar's nephew Octavian, and then Lepidus, who everybody forgets, right? But Antony has Cicero executed. And then ultimately, guess what we have? We have another civil war, right? The second triumvirate breaks down. Octavian and Antony go at it, and ultimately Octavian emerges as the victor, and he kind of self-proclaims that, actually I'm no more special than the rest of you, and establishes the name Princeps, the first among the people, and takes on the title Augustus, and de facto establishing now for good the Roman Empire, with all semblance of the Republic gone. Although he does, the Senate remains, praetors and consulships, all these things remain, but it is now it is now the empire at this point.
Yeah, the influence and power is all monopolized under the imperial dictator, essentially. And you Augustus played it smart. He ruled for 41 years. And he used a tremendous amount of propaganda, like coinage was the main form of propaganda for the emperors moving forward, and called himself the father of the nation. And he was just the first amongst the citizens, and lived in a very austere house for a Roman dictator, and didn't and put forth a lot of reforms, like Caesar, like Sulla, like the Gracchi brothers, that played to the plebeian class, the lower classes, and did a lot to ingratiate himself to the mob. And this allowed him to consolidate power. And if you didn't have Augustus's steady hand and intelligence, you wouldn't have had probably the beginning of a lot of peace through the Roman Empire. And so he's a very interesting figure to learn more about. So now we should talk a little bit, jump back to Britain, right?
Yeah.
And talk about the conquest of Britain, as that is kind of our lodestar through this series. What's going on in Britain at this time?
Yeah, so I mean, Britain is trying to continue on, and they are not formally part of the Roman jurisdiction at this point. They're kind of on the edges, and but there's a settling period that happens, and we go from Octavian, who's established this credibility, who's established the empire, a degree of normalcy, if you will. There's no more civil wars, at least for a period of time. You go through emperors Tiberius and Caligula. We've all heard of Caligula. And the next emperor is Claudius. And Claudius has an interesting past, and he's really out to prove himself. It's likely that he had some sort of deformity or something. And he is named emperor next, and he wants to make a name for himself by proving that he's worthy and deserving this of the title. And one of the things he does is he puts a sight on Britain, and so it is now time to reattempt to take the island. And so Claudius, military is led to England, to the island, and they of course run into opposition. And now we famously have an uprising led by a lady named Boudica. And there's the Boudican War. So, Chris, talk to us about that uprising and the battle there.
yeah, I don't know how there hasn't been a movie like made about Boudica like there was about William Wallace and Braveheart, because her story is just so fascinating. She is the wife of a tribal king, a tribal chief. And the Romans, when we talk about history and we talk about Claudius invades Britain and establishes a long-term foothold on the island, like that's very neutral language. What they're really doing is they're coming in and killing, destroying, stealing, raping, and they come in and in a battle kill Boudica's husband and take her hostage, and Roman soldiers rape her daughters in front of her. Well, this just infuriates her, and she starts organizing the tribes of southeast Britain, and they form a large contingent and chase the Romans out by and large. And it is one of the most interesting stories in history. Like, I would totally recommend just going to Wikipedia and reading about the Boudiccan Wars and Boudica herself. She is an inspiring freedom fighter and an inspiring person. There is a great podcast called The Ancients, and they did 2 great episodes on Boudica that really go into her backstory that I highly recommend. And I think that the person that is in the interview is saying the birth of the Roman Republic, it comes about because of the rape of Lucretia, who is a noblewoman and is taken advantage of by a foreign power that is established itself as the king of Britain, or the king of Rome, I should say. And this outrages the people in Rome so much that they end the monarchy and form the republic. And they make the parallel of, at the end of the Roman Republic, you have a similar story in Boudica, who exemplifies the same level of outrage at the Roman Empire that comes in and treads on her. So really recommend you look into Boudica. She's just a fascinating person. So, there is a felt impact in the early days on the population in the daily life during the conquest. But eventually they establish cities and they establish Roman political rule. They establish a trade economy, defense, and your average life starts to improve in Britain because of the Roman Empire, because now you have trading routes open. You have, instead of warring, feuding clans, you now have some established central law and a military that has established order there. And so over the next 500 years, you have I wouldn't say it's a peaceful time. If you're a Druid, your entire religion was exterminated.
Right.
But eventually, it settles in Britain. And let's talk a little bit about Hadrian's Wall, because this is like the most famous piece. Why don't you bring us up to the period of Hadrian's Wall? Yeah,
sure. So, after Claudius, there's, Nero comes next. And, I think most people have heard of Nero and that he's a little bit crazy, right? And there's the fire and such. And over the next couple of decades, it's rocky for the empire again. But ultimately, the last of this kind of run of challenging emperors is Domitian, and he's assassinated through a plot amongst the court officials. And Nerva is established as the emperor, and he's considered to be the first of what our history refers to as the 5 good emperors, right? So there's this now period of time. You may have heard of the phrase Pax Romana, right? The peace of Rome. This is that era where we go from the 5 good emperors in the next, roughly century. So Nerva is the first of those. His claim to fame, if you will, was there was actually a peaceful transition of power, right, following him. And he had no descendants, right? So there was a little bit of a question mark as to who would be next. And so that next emperor ends up being Trajan. He is known for massive public works programs and really working on reshaping the infrastructure. And, a lot of the construction that happened. I mean, still some of it still remains today in Rome. And then following Trajan is Hadrian. And we'll talk a little bit more about the Hadrian Wall and that and such here in a second. But, Hadrian is known for, he got out of Rome and went across the empire, and he really tried to establish himself as a visible presence, showing that, he kind of quote unquote cared about the people all throughout the empire. He would bring his imperial retinue of specialists and administrators, and there's a lot of focus on military preparedness and discipline, and really focused on I'd say bringing the strength, if you will, of the center of the empire out to the periphery of the empire. And that is part of what led to the building of the wall on the island of Britain. And then he's followed by Antonius Pius, the fourth of the five good emperors, effective administrator, leads to a large surplus in the treasury, working on access to water, lots of, again, good public works and infrastructure. And then finally, Marcus Aurelius, who I think many people have heard of. He's the fifth of the good emperors. I think a lot of people remember him more for his meditations and Stoic philosophy, but he was actually one of the emperors and a pretty good one as history looks back. Now, by the time of Marcus Aurelius, there are military conflicts beginning to emerge on all sorts of peripheries of the empire. Luckily, the works by Hadrian have allowed for good defense on the edges, but this is kind of that period of time where the Roman Empire is really at its height.
Yeah, it's called the Pax Romana. You may remember that from high school. You have a functioning state and you have little conflict, and really you have conflict, right? Okay. You just don't have civil war. So the Romans aren't fighting each other. That's why it's called the Pax Romana. But you have the Hadrian's Wall built because the tribes in the north of the Scots are trying to invade into England, into Roman Britain. So there's a reason that the wall is built, and the Antonine Wall is built up higher, and that eventually gets blocked. But you have at the edges of, so I guess the way to put it is like, we all know why Rome fell, right? The barbarians invaded. The barbarians were always testing the limits and the outer bands of the Roman Empire. It's the ones that wouldn't buy into the Roman system, I should say.
Yeah, and go ahead, finish your thought.
Just the state eventually after the Pax Romana weakened so much that they could no longer fight off the Gauls, the Huns, the Visigoths.
Yeah, and I think one of the things, I've read that Hadrian was seeking to accomplish this is, there's not a great natural boundary or border necessarily on the island of Britain to basically be like, north of here is not us, south of here is us. And so the wall intended to do that in partially in recognition that like, okay, we're done here, right? We're not going to go try to conquer the entire island. Similar things are along the continent and out east. There were natural boundaries, or where they weren't, Hadrian sought to basically put a pause or an end to some of the expansion, because the ability to maintain all that infrastructure and keep everything running, it's incredibly expensive, right? And so part of the purpose of Hadrian's Wall was to basically say, like, Rome is not going to go any further than this.
Well, let's end it there. We will talk about the weakening of the empire in the 3rd century. We'll cover AD 180 to 425 in the next episode, and talk about Diocletian and Constantine and Rome leaving Britain and all the consequences of that. And we thank you for joining us. Thank you, Matt.
Thank you, Chris.
Thank you for joining us here on the History of Modern Politics. If you want to get emails, show notes, video of these episodes, I mean, you can't imagine how handsome Matt and I are. So go check that out, and reading list too, at thehistoryofmodernpolitics.com, and support the show by joining there. Thank you so much, and we will see you next episode.